You love her voice, you love her looks, but Melissa loves our comic books. Hi, everybody, welcome back. Let's do one more episode. Today, we're going to talk about, let's see here. If you've been paying attention, you've seen me frame this narrative of the early history of comic books many times as a contest where comic book reprints or original material will win the future of the industry, but it can't be both. There are no real binary choices, though, and in 1937, a Manhattan printer named Everett Arnold came to the same conclusion. Arnold had been keeping his eye on the nascent comic book industry for a while now. In 1936, he had even helped Comics Magazine get off the ground, but he was not a business partner in that venture. In fact, he had carefully been watching them to see what they might have been doing wrong. Relying on all original material was problematic because there just weren't enough good freelancers in the industry yet, and quality was all over the place, from brilliant to utter dreck. And people still wanted comic book reprints, comic strip reprints, pardon me. Those books were selling well, even as more competition kept entering the field. So he made the decision that he was going to offer people both. The company he founded was called Comic Favorites. It would become known as Quality Comics in 1940 and known as that forever thereafter. He made a deal with 3 syndicates to pick up some of their big-name features, all at the expense of Eastern Color, which suddenly lost Dixie Dugan, Jane Arden, Joe Pluka, and Mickey Finn, all strips I've talked about in the past and won't really go over in this episode. What Arnold must have thought was his real coup, though, was securing the first reprint in comic books of Rube Goldberg. Reuben Garrett Lucius Goldberg, better known as Rube Goldberg, was comic strip royalty. Born in San Francisco in 1883, Rube trained to be an engineer before tossing it aside to become a newspaper cartoonist. His first big comic strip, Foolish Questions, is mostly forgotten today, but in the 1910s it was a big deal. From 1911 to 1915, newspaper chains were fighting over him, and his salary kept going up to get him to stay put. Following the career trajectory of Winsor McCay, Goldberg also drew his own animated shorts that aired in theaters. What he was best known for, though, and is still known for, was drawing ridiculously complex inventions. And we still call these Rube Goldberg inventions to this day, even by people who really have no idea who Rube Goldberg was. Goldberg had just started a new strip called Lollapalooza in 1936. Lala was the widow of a rich husband. She had married up and was now constantly embarrassed by her poor, lazy brother, Vince. This strip was not good. In fact, Goldberg's career had been on the decline ever since 1932. He was in his 50s now, and though he was still a prolific artist, his ideas seemed stale and dated. All of these features were found in the first issues of Arnold's first comic book title, Feature Funnies. Feature Funnies launched before Arnold had any original material to go in it, but he was working on that. He was in the process of stealing George Brenner away from Comics Magazine. Brenner somehow retained the rights to the character he had created for Comics Magazine, The Clock, and brought that character over to Feature Funnies in his 3rd issue. I've also talked about The Clock before, so I will not be going over that much in this video. I did want to hit on something really important about The Clock, though. Brenner, saw that masked mystery men like the Shadow and the Spider were popular, but there was an audience out there without the time or the patience to get through a long book with multiple setbacks for the hero. The Clock could have an adventure with the same dramatic outcome for the villains, but get there much faster in a more condensed, streamlined story. And I want you to file that away in your brain because that's going to come up really important when we get to the superhero genre. Now, I would be done with this episode already if it wasn't for the next person Arnold recruited from Comics Magazine, and that was Will Eisner. As I've talked about before, Will Eisner had done a few standalone stories for Comics Magazine before this point, and may or may not have written a few more. but the lion's share of his work in comics up to this point was not published in the US, but in the UK inside the magazine Wags. But before we get into that, let's quickly review what kind of work this was. In these early days of the comic book industry, I have said many times that there were not a lot of professional comic book artists, but there were increasingly more companies that wanted to produce original comic book material. And if you wanted to do this without spending the money up front on assembling your own art studio, then you contracted out to a third-party studio that generated content on demand for publishers. Now, I've already talked at length about the first of those, Harry Chesworth Studio, which was first out of the gate and my least favorite. And the second was this one, Syndicated Features Corporation, also known as the Eisner Iger Studio. Will Eisner had founded this with Jerry Iger, a self-trained cartoonist who had done some original filler material for Eastern Color's famous Funnies before creating the magazine Wow. This was the previous year in 1936. Iger was the editor and hired Eisner after recognizing his great skill, but the only place it could find any distribution for Wow was in the UK, where it didn't do well and disappeared after just 4 issues. But at least it got their foot in the door with UK publishers because one of them wanted a new magazine that was going to be called Wags, and they needed lots of comic book material for it. They would soon hire other young artists to work cheap for them in exchange for experience, like, for instance, Jack Kirby. We will talk about him over and over again much later. But this became the studio that was the Eisner Iger Studio. Now, the material Eisner was producing for Wags was far superior to the more amateurish work he had produced for Comics Magazine. It seems unlikely that in this short span of time he had actually become a better artist, and more likely that he had just felt that he would put as much effort into the stories as he felt he was being paid for. Early features that Eisner created for the studio included a private detective action feature called Scott Dalton and a period pirate adventure called The Flame. But there was also something extra special that Eisner had worked on, which he poured all of his considerable talent into, hoping it would break into the lucrative newspaper market. Given their studio's foothold in the UK, he was expecting to be picked up in the foreign market, where even the Sunday pages were printed in black and white. So Eisner developed an inking style with great use of contrast that would look great on the page without color. And this feature was called, no, not The Spirit, that's coming up later. This is Hawks of the Seas. And I happen to have a reprint volume of it right here. As Eisner wrote in the foreword to Dark Horse's 2003 hardcover collection of this strip, I'm going to read this out loud to you. Normally I do the analysis, but Will Eisner has actually provided the analysis of his own strip for us, so let's take advantage. He wrote, not that page. In retrospect, what is most significant to me about this work is that its origin represents the confluence of my writing and art at this point in my career. As a youngster, my main sources of literary nutrition were Robert Louis Stevenson and Raphael Sabatini. These, mixed with James Fenimore Cooper and later the gritty pulp magazines, along with the short story genre extant at that time, formed the basis of my sense of what adventure and storytelling were all about. For me, in these early dreaming years, adventure was costume men who were dashing, athletic, and who swashbuckled their way around faraway places in earlier times. Their costumes were largely influenced by the early Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth illustrations that seemed always to appear in the editions of Treasure Island and Captain Blood I bought secondhand. In any event, I really threw myself into this feature. It was my first real adventure work, and I tried all the techniques I was absorbing from all the well-known illustrators of the time. It was an era of black and white, and I thought in that mood. Eisner was all of 20 years old at this time. There was an unexpected bonus to publishing first in the UK. The studio could test out features overseas, but Wags did not have exclusivity to the content. They could still shop these features around then in the US and try to sell them again. And this finally brings us back around to Everett Arnold's comic favorites, because Hawks of the Seas debuted in the third issue of Feature Funnies. Unlike most comic strip reprints, the first installment of Hawks begins with the very first page, which gives us a rough ballpark of when the story takes place, sometime in the mid-17th century, when the Spanish Empire first started to decline. We have a MacGuffin in the case of a near-priceless Incan ruby, coming from South America no less, the ruby likely then having come from Brazil or Colombia specifically. We're introduced to our first villain, the pirate Claw Carlos, also a corrupt governor of some territory that is not ever identified. And then we're slowly introduced to our hero, who appears only at the very end of the first installment. And we don't even learn his name in the first installment. In the second installment, we do. But before then, he threatens to kill Carlos if he even speaks it out loud. It's so mysterious. It is not until the second installment in issue 4 that we learn that he is actually a fellow pirate known only as the Hawk, and he claims to be both an American and the ruby's rightful owner. The Spanish princess who gave him the ruby, and she is Spanish even though she's a blonde, which probably came from a colorist who wasn't looking at the text. But anyways, she feels betrayed when she learns that the Hawk is another pirate, and she betrays Hawk in return. But the Hawk easily escapes from jail, and by the end of 1937, he is confronting that corrupt governor I mentioned, and, well, we're going to have to revisit Hawks of the Seas again sometime. But that's where we're leaving off today. This is just an introduction to Feature Funnies, quality comics, and we will visit them again when we get to 1938. We have one more video to make of 1937 that's going to wrap everything up, and I'm hoping to get to that real soon. To make sure that you see it, please like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And also, you'll find in the comments section, there's going to be links to the stories themselves if you wanted to read along, or if you wanted to join the Patreon and help support this channel, then there's that option as well. I'm hoping to talk to everybody soon. Feel free to leave comments for me, and thank you for spending this time with me. Bye-bye.